Welcome to the Blended Finance Project interview series, where we talk to international development and solidarity scholars, labor and civil society activists about the recent turn to so-called innovative finance for development in Canada. I'm your host, Susan Spronk, Associate Professor at the School of International Development and Global Studies at the University of Ottawa.
Hi, everyone. So we're here today with Jennifer Del Rosario Melanso. So for the last number of years, Jennifer has worked for the Ebon Foundation in the Philippines. The Ebon Foundation is a capacity development non-governmental organization operating around the world with head offices in Manila, Philippines, Andhra Pradesh, India, Brussels, Belgium, and Nairobi, Kenya. She was also previously the interim Global Secretariat Coordinator at the Reality of Aid Network. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, Susan. Thank you for having me. Just a bit of introduction on Ebon. We are from Ebon International Foundation because our mother institution was Ebon Foundation, which was the original institution established since 1978 in the Philippines to do socioeconomic research and information sharing. For Ebon International, as you've mentioned, we work internationally and we cover various development issues, including development finance. And so thank you for inviting us to this interview.
Great, thank you. So the first question is about blended finance. And so proponents of blended finance describe it as a novel way of financing development that uses public funds to leverage private finance to meet development goals. So how would you characterize the rise in the impact of blending and other private sector instruments in the financing for development agenda? Where did this agenda come from, and which global actors are pushing for it?
All right. So in the case of blending and the general trend of having the private sector in the discussions and development, this actually came from the narratives from the post-2015 development agenda. So since then, the narrative has solidified, basically arising from questions on problems about quantity and quality of the official development aid, or ODA. For the longest time, over half a century, many donor states have not been fulfilling their aid commitments. And a lot of the issues that have been raised when the effectiveness agenda was brought in early 2000s have still not been addressed. So such as tide aid, and how aid relationships still very much are skewed towards who holds the power of the purse, right? So since then, the development community have been accommodating business rules in the mandate of ODA, which actually is supposedly about addressing poverty and inequalities. In the Addis Ababa Action Agenda, which is the 2015 outcome of the Third Financing for Development Conference, these roles for the private sector have been further solidified with language such as ensuring the transformative potential of people and the private sector. Meaning putting what is public and private at par with each other. So putting the private sector at the same level as other actors have really led to this idea that the private sector could help realize development alongside their, of course, commercial and business interests, their pursuit for financial returns. So this really enabled the current narrative that development can be achieved by leveraging ODA, private sector, through the use of ODA. So a lot of talks in various development finance arenas bring up the issue of using aid to catalyze development investments and encourage, the private sector to come in, supposedly because financing is really needed from their sources. So in terms of who promotes this narrative of having the private sector deep into the development agenda, of course, there are the donor states. They are, of course, promoting the interests as well of their own corporations. So this includes the OECD. But aside from that, a lot of the development banks, especially led by the IMF World Bank, are churning out narratives about the key role of the private sector. So for instance, the World Bank has, since I think 2017, promoted what it called then as its cascade approach, but later on called it the maximizing finance for development approach, which basically puts a premium on the private sector. So private sector first, meaning that they will offer private sector driven choices for developing countries who need financing. So the public sources now becomes a last resort in this so-called cascade approach of the World Bank. And then, of course, being dominant in the whole development finance conversation, other development banks has followed what the IMF World Bank has been saying. So this giving primacy to private sector is also echoed in, for instance, in the Asian context, the Asian Development Bank Strategy 2030, even in the China-led Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, they are also mouthing this narrative of mobilizing private capital. And then for the G20, what they have been pushing is mainly on infrastructure, focusing on bankable projects. So they are actually pushing for countries to undertake big ticket infrastructure projects with the crowding in of private sector finance for these countries. So basically, it's corporations, the big private sector, including those in the financial sector, are being called in to fill in the so-called financing gaps, especially during this recession and amid this whole pandemic. Now, in terms of impacts of this whole private sector engagement narrative, of course, if you put the public sector and the private sector in the same at par with each other, then it means that profit is as important as people's welfare and development needs, right? So important questions on public interest are sidelined. And of course, what dominates is how the private sector would be able to ensure the returns on their investments. And overall, this actually made the challenges of development as merely a problem of financing, rather than delving into more political questions or more structural questions on how things are in the world today.
Excellent. So when we read these documents by the World Bank, a lot of the global discourse is always about risk. So when we're talking about blended finance, the private sector instruments, a lot of it is about risk mitigation for the private sector, and there's very little attention to the risk for vulnerable populations. So what would you say are some of the risks of pursuing this agenda for vulnerable populations around the world?
All right. In giving priority to private finance and addressing their risk, right? The risk to their investments. The risk to people, especially the communities on the ground, are sidelined. So really, it worsens the existing inequalities that we have been facing in the global south, and even in the global north. So there are many impacts of this giving primacy to private finance and ensuring that they have risk-free investments. This includes, of course, more and more social services become inaccessible to the poor or to those who are marginalized. The sectors who are already barely reached by social services become all the more deprived. No? But aside from that, of course, with the projects pursued with the corporate or private sector interest in mind, then the interests of communities are sidelined, and development aggression has, over the years, really impacted on various communities, especially, for example, those who are in the rural areas. If the projects of development banks like the ADB or the World Bank, as it is, they are more and more biased, of course, to the interests of the corporations and the elite in the country where they are implemented. Now, especially if they are co-financed by these corporations, the risk become greater for the communities. And they are definitely not anymore even consulted, no participation whatsoever in the planning, in implementing, etc., which should happen if there is really, democratic development process existing in a country. So yeah, so it really risks leaving more and more people behind as in relation to the so-called call of the Agenda 2030 to leave no one behind. Unfortunately, what is happening is more and more people are being left behind because of this giving more importance to the private sector. Even the United Nations Financing for Sustainable Development Office itself, in their report, the 2020 Financing for Sustainable Development report, has admitted many limits to the blended finance and the overall push for private sector engagement in development. So, for example, the FSDR says that blended finance has not really mobilized the supposedly large amounts of finance that would come in because of these arrangements. Of course, these investments would follow their commercial interests. So they would go to countries that are less riskier, so to speak. So they would really, of course, follow where they can make profitable returns. So instead of addressing development challenges in poorer countries, usually the blended finance projects, contrary to the claims, are going to mostly middle income countries where they can get more profits. So the FSDR admits that blended finance is not a panacea to fill the investment gap. Second, they have not really impacted on poverty. So they have generally had only modest impact on poverty, and that more often the development impact is unknown. So while they continue to push for blended finance and put out claims of it helping in development, really there is no proof of that so far. So, and on the other hand, blended finance poses really huge risk to the ownership of development, as I mentioned earlier. The people are hardly involved, and the FSDR admits that even governments, if they are involved, they are involved only after the investment decision has been made, and that governments play relatively less significant roles. So then I think people have much less involvement in this blended finance project decision making.
So my final question is about COVID. One of the things that COVID has done is shone a spotlight on inequality, and that's been true both between countries but also within countries. So you were talking about the importance of providing basic services, for example, public services. Health is one of the very obvious ones that we can talk about in the context of the pandemic. And in Canada and in also Quebec, one of the things that's been highlighted about the problems of the risk of the privatization model is the for-profit model. In the first wave, 80% of the deaths in the province of Ontario were in long-term care homes, and the rates of death were much higher in private for-profit care homes. So I'm noticing there's a public shift in terms of much questioning around this model, and I'm wondering if you could share with us what your perspective is on that question. Have you noticed any shifts because of the COVID pandemic in terms of the financing for development agenda? And also these questions around private sector engagements. How has the coronavirus pandemic shifted some of the discourse around these questions? Has it changed?
So because the pandemic has exposed much more the problems, structural problems in the world, particularly the health and the inequalities and the economic problems. There has been some talk about greater state regulation, but at the same time, we also notice that it's still business as usual. No? The donors and multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, they still are really promoting blended finance and private sector engagement, and the narrative that is emerging in the building back better conversations is that the system is not at all a problem. So the fundamental characteristic of the world economy that is dominated by corporate giants and finance capital remains the same. There just have to be some actions that the state has to do in terms of, for example, ensuring that there are some social protection, etc. But the whole dependence on finance capital and that the private sector is important in the recovery post-COVID is still the dominant narrative that's being promoted, no, in whatever arenas you go into. For example, whether you are in the arena of the UN, the financing for development, or even in engaging with, for example, the OECD DAC. It's still the whole claim about the private sector is really important for recovery remains. No, it still doesn't admit really to the role of the neoliberal policy and in all the problems that have been existing before COVID and that have been exacerbated with the pandemic. So, I think there is really not much change that we see in terms of the financing for development agenda. The biggest question about dependence on private finance, private capital. It's still being pushed by the donors, by the IMF, World Bank, and other development banks. So, but on a happier note, we are, of course, hopeful that people will continue to push for change. In the last 2 years, for example, before the pandemic hit in 2019, and even during the pandemic, people's resistance have been also very much vibrant, no, with protests erupting in different parts of the world, calling for genuine change and in genuinely addressing the concerns and the needs of people. So there is, of course, hope that with people, civil society organizations, and social movements pushing for a break from what has been established, the neoliberal policies, we will be able to end the sufferings of our peoples, whether we are in the global south or in the global north. So I think with our pushing for greater ambition, with our push for better democratic processes within countries and even internationally in the global arena, we have something to look forward to. So I just think that keeping the spirit up, keeping the fighting spirit up, especially amid the pandemic, is important. And we have the vibrant movements, whether in developing countries such as the Philippines or in developed countries like Canada. They are our really hope.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for all the work that you do. It was really great talking to you and learning more about the work that the Aibon Foundation International has done. And we look forward to hearing more.
Thanks. Bye.